Yes. Now, welcome to this Shakti Traditions online lecture. I'm very pleased and honored indeed to introduce Professor Harunaga Isaacson, Director of the Center for Tantric Studies at the Department of Indian and Tibetan Studies at the University of Hamburg. Professor Isaacson is a world-renowned Sanskritist and specialist in Indian religious and philosophical literature, including Purāṇic literature such as the Skanda, Purana, and Tantric traditions in pre-13th century South Asia, and that is in the long durée of early medieval Indian history, which Alexis Sanderson has termed the Shaiva Age. Professor Isaacson also holds a great love for Sanskrit poetry, which I've had the pleasure of experiencing at seminars in Oxford. In Buddhist Studies, to which his work is in no way confined, his research focuses mainly on the Yogini Tantra traditions of the Vajrayāna. In this field, he has offered groundbreaking contributions and insights in the relationship and interactions of these traditions with non-Buddhist tantric systems, particularly Tantric Shaivism and indeed Śāktism. Thus the title of today's lecture, Interactions, Intersections, Śāktism and the Indian Vajrayāna. So without further ado, I will leave the word to you.
Thank you so much indeed for the kind invitation and the very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here, so to speak, in this online space, whatever it is, and feel very honored to have been asked to speak in this series. So I'm very happy to be here again. I have to apologize, though, that I don't think that I have any groundbreaking insights or contributions to share with you today. Indeed, I don't feel myself to be an expert in Śāktism at all, and not really in the Indian Vajrayāna either. It is such a vast area that, though I love to study it, I feel that much of the material, much of the textual material, which is my usual main focus, I have not even begun to study so far. Still, I will try indeed to say something, and I'm going to take as my starting point a quotation from a wonderful lecture in this same online series on Shakti traditions. The quotation goes like this, and this was the part that I'm going to quote was the first of three reasons which Alexis Sanderson gave as a refutation of the hypothesis, the possible hypothesis, that Shakta Shaiva and particularly Kaula traditions were fringe traditions. And you can all watch this lecture online, listen to it online. I strongly recommend it. So the quotation is thus, Professor Sanderson says, the existence of a vast Buddhist literature, so this is a reason which refutes this possible hypothesis, the existence of a vast Buddhist literature, which is modeled on the Shakta Shaiva traditions we've been looking at. Texts such as the Hevajra and Lagushamvara and others are not conceivable except as an attempt to utilize the models developed by these Shakta Shaivas, and as it were to put them to Buddhist work in their relations with the laity in East India. I don't think that Buddhism would have gone to the extent of developing a kind of parallel literature if it were not the case that these Shakta cults were a major force in the religion of the time. That would certainly apply for East India, and I think also for Kashmir, where these traditions also flourished very strongly. Thus, Professor Sanderson. Now, I agree with Professor Sanderson in his the point that he is making here, which is basically that the Yogini Tantra literature, the word Yogini Tantra is not actually used in this particular quote, but I think he used it in the parallel place, so to speak, in his handout for the lecture. So the point is that this literature, Hevajra, Lagushamvara, and other examples of Yogini Tantra literature, excuse me, can be taken as, the existence of it can be taken as a kind of a proof, one of the strong arguments showing that Shakta Shaiva material was really widespread and popular. So on this point, I completely agree. However, I, as it were, try to supply now a little bit of a footnote to Professor Sanderson's comments here, comments which had a particular aim, a particular point that he wished to make. And I'm sure that Professor Sanderson would agree that the literature of the Buddhist literature that he refers to here is vast and complex, and there are other things that can be said about it. So I will try to make a few points, as it were, in supplement, as a supplement of what Professor Sanderson has said here. And of course, what I present is basically my very limited standpoint based on limited knowledge of vast and difficult material. Now let me see. I want to start perhaps by giving a simple example of a Buddhist tantric work, Yogini Tantra related, not actually a tantra itself. But then Professor Sanderson too, I think, probably had not only the tantras themselves in mind when he referred to a vast body of Buddhist literature, Buddhist tantric literature. So I take a small example from a Yogini Tantra related work. It is a stotra, a hymn, a praise of Vajrayogini, the Buddhist deity Vajrayogini, and this praise is attributed to a siddha, a realized saint, let's say, called Virupa, a famous name within Buddhist tantric traditions. And what I want to illustrate here is, first of all, that one can indeed say, simply on a very simple level or basis, the basis of terminology, the use of words and terms, one can say that we can see here influence of, or the use of terminology and ideas which probably have a Shakta Shaiva origin. So I quote just a few lines here. The first line is Shunyata Giyate Chaso Parashaktihi, my first typo, Para. So the line says something like, and this goddess Vajrayogini is sung as she is taught to be emptiness, and then perhaps we could supply an and at the same time she is highest power, highest Shakti, and then we have Para here, which one could take as a compound, highest and at the same time lower, or something like that. Okay, one can, as always, translate in various different ways, but roughly I think you get the gist. Now here what is striking is that the second quarter, the second part of this half line, Para Shakti Para, this has a very Shaiva ring, and not only that, the quarter, the verse quarter, this expression can indeed be found literally in, I think, more than one Shaiva Tantra. For instance, I think you will find it in the Tantra Sabhava Tantra, a famous Trika Tantra, and probably as a result of borrowing, it is also in the Swachanda Tantra, for instance. Okay, so we see on the one hand here an expression and terminology which is rather strikingly Shaiva, I would say. And on the other hand, combined with this expression in the very same line, we have the expression distinctly more Buddhist sounding, Shunyata Giyate Chaso. She is also taught as, or sung as, or proclaimed as emptiness. Here, let me pause also to mention that the very term Shakti and terms such as Shakta are actually strikingly rare in the Buddhist material, in the Buddhist Tantric material. So if I may briefly digress on this point, although it is understandable, no doubt, that several scholars have spoken of Indian esoteric Buddhism or Indian Tantric Buddhism as Buddhist Śāktism, for instance, or Shakta Buddhism, I would suggest that it might be useful to be just a little bit cautious about applying such terms, no matter what strong similarities we might find on some points, or no matter what evidence we may see of interactions and some kind of interdependence. The difference in terminology, nonetheless, I think should be taken seriously. I have to confess, by the way, that on the Shaiva side, I'm also not entirely sure that the term Shaktism has been so clearly defined, or that it is so clear how such a term relates to, for instance, yes, how do we relate exactly Yogini, Shakti, Devi? Anyway, these are subjects which probably several other speakers in this series have touched on in various ways. I have to also confess that I have not yet caught up with listening to all the lectures in this wonderful series. I have heard Professor Sanderson's and some part of a few others, but you see, I'm probably much more ignorant of Shaktism than many of the hearers. Okay, so my main point here was to highlight this, on the one hand, striking similarity in expression to the language of Shaiva Tantras, such as the Tantras of Bhava, again, a Trika Tantra, let's say a Goddess Tantra. And on the other hand, the way that this is paired in the same line with an expression which is far more Buddhist in its sound. The next line, Pushtida Purani Nityam Trailokya Kshobhani Tata, does not perhaps sound very striking. Nonetheless, on examination, I do not find the term Trailokya Kshobhani, shaking the three worlds, something like this. I do not find this term in general use in Buddhist material. This is the only such instance that I know of at the moment. While on the contrary, it is strikingly common, I think, in Shaiva material, in Shakta material, and also in, by the way, goddess-related Purāṇic literature. I think you can find the same adjective used. And one more line here. Bindunada kalatita, prajnaparamita mata. Again, it seems to me that, like in the first line that I quoted, there is something of a pairing here. In one line of a very Buddhist way of expression, prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom, as this is often translated. And on the other hand, an expression which sounds rather Shaiva, Bindunada Kalatita, referring to the subtle classifications or gradations of sound, or particularly mantric sound. Pardon me. My voice has its problems today. I was already speaking for many hours, I think. Apologies for that. Okay, so in this case, I am not suggesting, because I think it is not quite true, that Bindunada Kalatita is a completely unknown expression on the Buddhist side. At least Bindunada, this much at least, this combination, is extremely common in Buddhist discussions also, of the same matter, of subtle levels, again, of sound. Nonetheless, here too, I would suggest that we have a pairing, and I even suggest that it may be a deliberate pairing of a term which is more at home in a Shaiva, whether or not Shakta, perhaps, a Shaiva environment, and a Buddhist term, Prajnaparamita. So, Bindunada Kalatita, Prajnaparamita, somehow to me embodies almost, I used it as the heading for this slide, this relationship of, on the one hand, influence or intersection, or very possibly interdependence. Things are always interdependent in some way, after all. And Prajnaparamita highlighting a continuity within the Buddhist tradition. The goddess who is here being praised, Vajrayogini, is one of those who may often seem particularly Shaiva at a glance at her iconography, for instance. It depends. But the author of the stotra seems to deliberately, while perhaps toying with the close relationship or the close affinity with Shaiva material, he seems to be trying to assert a Buddhist continuity. Prajnaparamita, I used her as the image for the cover, as it were, of these slides. This was partly because I wasn't sure if I could find a Vajrayogini or more strongly Shakta-looking image, which was in the public domain at short notice, but also because of this continuity. Because when we look at the Buddhist Yogini Tantras, what I want to stress is that apart from an influence or interdependence with an interaction with Shaiva and Shakta material, apart from that, I would see it as running through our material a strong continuity with earlier Buddhist tradition. So while agreeing with Professor Sanderson that one can hardly imagine this literature, this body of Yogini Tantra literature, arising in the form that it does, in the form that we have it, without interaction with Shaiva material. At the same time, one should also stress that the Yogini Tantra material also could not possibly have arisen as it does without strong dependence on and continuity with earlier Buddhist tradition. And Prajnaparamita herself, the image that I showed of her at the beginning is a famous and famously beautiful one from Java from maybe the 13th century or so. But she has been worshipped as a goddess with a long tradition in Buddhism. We are here looking at a little bit from a stotra to Vajrayogini, this wilder looking deity, and she is identified with Prajnaparamita, but we have stotras to Prajnaparamita herself, which go back for more than half a millennium, I think well over half a millennium, before this particular textual material. Ah yes, there was one more bit that I quoted here from Virupa Stotra. Pralayotpatti hinacha, pralayotpatti karini, shashvatatvat stito prokta, shashvatena cha varjita. Here, the terminology again, to me sounds like it is flirting with a more theistic terminology or theistic context in Pralayotpatti karini, but at the same time, things are here being put in the way of paradoxes or apparent paradoxes, with the more theistic sounding expressions being deliberately balanced by their near opposites. Not quite their opposites, one could argue. Actually, this is a little bit complex. Let me also just briefly remark before I pass on from this particular material, briefly remark that there are textual questions here about the text of Virupa Stotra. I have cited it from the oldest manuscript known to me, which is, I think, the best manuscript. The text has also been published a few times, and in the published text, you will see different readings in a few places, including a few places that I show here. For instance, the published forms of this text have parat para instead of para para. This does not change very much, but it is the formulation para para found again in this oldest manuscript of the work. It is this formulation that gives us an exact parallel with a verse quarter which perhaps might be said to be famous even on the Shaiva or Shaiva Shakta side. Okay, there are some other details of readings here too. which time forbids me to go into, tempting though they are, but I wanted to, as a side remark, make this point too, that also for the evaluation of such larger issues, let us say, as how traditions interacted with each other. Traditions will always interact somehow with each other, but exactly how is a very complex matter. So these larger questions are affected often materially by what some would deem the smaller or lower level questions of philology and, for instance, of what readings are to be preferred, what readings are found, and what readings are to be preferred. How do these readings relate? So these questions of textual scholarship, they do affect, often in important ways, how we might arrive at answers to the larger questions of interactions between traditions. Okay, now I want to pass from this, having hoped to have made one central point, this point that the interdependence and the influence, for instance, influence from Shaivism on Yogini Tantra material, that this is not the only the only element of the picture. That to understand the Buddhist material better on its own terms, we need to say more than just the fact, true though it no doubt is, in varying degrees depending on which material we look at, the fact that it is modeled on or is influenced by Shakta sources. So now I turn to Yogini Tantras themselves. And I first want to very briefly look at or present one or two self-references within these texts to, first of all, highlight or establish, clear though it may seem to be, that we do have such scriptures self-identifying, not only being identified by others, as it were, from outside themselves, but we have these texts self-identifying as, for instance, Yogini Tantras. And I take my examples here from the Buddhikapala Tantra, a somewhat less well-known Tantra than the Hevajra and Lagushamvara, which we have, the names of which we have already encountered. So my first very short quote is Imam Tantra Maharajam Yogini Nam Niruttaram, in somewhat rough or non-standard Sanskrit, which gives us roughly the sense of this great king of a Tantra is the supreme Niruttaram, the unexcelled Tantra of Yoginis, or the Yoginis. And a little bit later, in the same opening chapter of the same text, we have the expression Sarvasiddhi Yogini Yanam. And Yogini Yanam, I found an interesting term, which seems not to be often used. So it would literally mean something like the vehicle or the way, but perhaps vehicle would be the first thing that one thinks of. The vehicle of the Yoginis, Sarva Siddhi perhaps, which brings all siddhis as a Bahuvrihi compound. This Yogini Yanam, it seems to me useful to note how the learned scholar Abhayakara Gupta, writing in about the 12th century, the first part of the 12th century, explains this. In his commentary on the Buddhikapala Tantra, he tells us, Yogini Yanam iti Yogini Tantram. Again, this expression Yanam is, however, striking, and perhaps one could say, speaking very roughly or simplistically, as I'm afraid that I tend to do very often, one could say that this is, again, a more Buddhist expression. Probably most are aware of expressions such as Mahayana, Hinayana, and may be aware that in general, Yana classifications are a principal way in which Buddhists self-organize or self-classify, or present classifications of soteriologies. Something like this, to put it rather roughly. Very good. So in my previous slide, I have tried to establish in a very simple way, and of course there's much more material that could have been adduced, in a very simple way, that these so-called Yogini Tantras also self-identify indeed with such a term as Yogini Tantras. Now this raises all kinds of interesting questions, it seems to me, most of which I will have to leave undiscussed right now, but let me just briefly say there is a question, a very large question, about how Buddhists understood their own Tantric scriptures to be classified. And this was not a straightforward matter. And what we find in the literature presents a very high degree of variety. We find many different classification schemes coexisting within the same period. So there are interesting problems there of how the scriptures are to be classified, or from another perspective, how it is that the diversity of classifications coexisting is to be seen, is to be understood by us. Another question which is raised by this term Yogini Tantra is, what do these compounds mean exactly? So on the Buddhist side, if we see, for instance, terms such as Kriya Tantra, Yoga Tantra, and then perhaps paired with that, this is often paired together, though not always, Yoga Tantra, Yogini Tantra. What is really the significance of these compounds? Are these compounds parallel? Are they tantras about kriya, for instance, charya, about ritual, about some type of special practice, about yoga, and about yoginis? Well, I wanted only to highlight that there are such questions, and I want to also emphasize that these questions are not so easy to solve. They may sound trivial at first hearing, but these matters of exactly how the terms are to be understood did, I think, really matter for at least the learned scholars who have written within the tradition. There's always this question of when we are reading the works that survive in Sanskrit, to what extent are the ideas, the views that we find therein, and the practices that we see taught therein, to what extent were these widespread, influential, beyond a coterie or a smaller group of learned scholars? These questions I can't, for the most part, address right now. But let me say that it is this material, after all, that allows us to get closest to the thoughts. We have still some way to go to seeing the practices that we only see at second or third hand, very indirectly. But these texts are the closest way that we can get to the thoughts of Buddhists living at this time. There is, of course, other very important material, but it does not give us their formulated thoughts. Okay, I feel a little bit tempted to digress about that, but I am at risk of having too many digressions already. I want to get back to my point here, and this is that within this complex question of how are the names of the Tantra classes to be understood, the term Yogini Tantra in particular probably was sometimes at least understood to be tantras taught by the yoginis. This is, of course, an analysis which will not work if we have a compound like Yoga Tantra. But with Yogini Tantra, I think it is a possible analysis, and at least some of our authors show, I think, some awareness of such an explanation. Now, the material here is again rather complex and large, and again, I have presented only a small part of it here. I give you first a slightly tricky, in a way, slightly tricky passage from Ratnakara Shanti, a great and I think very influential author of the 11th century or so, the first part of the 11th century. Now, commenting on the final sentence of a Tantra, the Mahamaya Tantra, he gives us this sentence, which is an analysis, I think, of a compound within the final sentence. Sadly, we don't have a Sanskrit manuscript of this Tantra available at the moment. Anyway, I think we have here an analysis of a compound within the final sentence and some glosses. So he says, Mahatyashchata Vajradakinyascha Tasam Matam Tat Parigrihitaha Siddhantaha. Okay, I seem to have some small problem again with my typesetting, but I hope that roughly this is all right. And the sense that is conveyed is probably he is seeing a compound, Mahavajradakini Matam. And he first tells us that Mahavajradakini is a Karmadharya compound. It means those who are both great and they are Vajradakinis. Okay, this is the first occurrence of the word Dakini. And it's another word which, another term which deserves a very long digression or a very long discussion, which we'll have to forego. Suffice it for the moment to say that in Buddhist sources, Dakini is often virtually exchangeable, interchangeable with Yogini. So Mahatyashchata Vajradakinyascha, those who are simultaneously great and they are Vajradakinis, Tasam Matam, it is their mata, it is their doctrine, or it could be taken as their teaching. So this looks to me like it is analyzing and explaining Mahavajradakini Mata as a compound, which I think would naturally suggest that the Tantra itself is claiming to be a teaching of great Vajradakinis. But Ratnakrashanti's further gloss then is somewhat striking. He gives us as further explanation, or as explanation really of what matam here signifies, or what does it mean to say that it is the mata of these great Vajradakinis. He says, Tat parigrihitaha siddhanta. And it seems to me that he has suggested hereby that maybe they are not the teachers after all. Parigrihitaha, accepted by them. So he seems to say that the mata of these Vajradakinis is the siddhantaha, roughly the teaching, but primarily with a philosophical implication or a doctrinal implication. The teaching or the doctrinal position which is accepted by or adopted by those Vajradakinis. So what I think we might see here, if I'm not reading too much into it, what we might see here is, on the one hand, that the Tantra itself rather implies by its formulation that it is the teaching of Vajradakinis, but that the commentator is downplaying this by his gloss, glossing it in a way which suggests that the Vajradakinis might not be the teacher. So you might say then that I have not yet presented much evidence for this idea that Yogini Tantra may have been understood, at least by some, as Tantras taught by or the teachings of the Yoginis. But there is, as I said, more material, and I give you only one more citation for the moment. This is from another, yet another learned exegetical work, a commentary on a Yogini Tantra. This one is a little bit later than Ratnakrashanti's time. The author says, just a brief sentence here quoted, Bhagavati hi Vaiśeṣika, though in fairness I should note that the manuscript I am mainly relying on here reads Deshita Mula Tantrasya Ityahuhu. I think nonetheless that the conjecture is rather certain, and that this sentence means, for they say, for the he, and they say for Ahuhu, that the Bhagavati, the Blessed One, female, is the teacher, Deshika, of the root Tantra. And another reason why we can be rather confident about this, apart from the fact that I think Deshita does not really work here, also grammatically it seems problematic to me. Another reason why we can be rather confident about this is because there are yet further remarks in exactly the same vein, but not with this textual problem, which confirmed that it was known to several of our learned commentators that, according to some at least, it is not the Bhagavan, it is not the male deity, but it is the Bhagavati, the female, his consort, let us say, who taught the Rut Tantras. Now, this expression Rut Tantra invites, it almost demands, but I will have to resist the demand, a discussion in itself, and a discussion which again would be interesting also from a comparative light, because we can find and trace and examine this idea of Rut Tantras and of the Tantras that are now available to us as being condensations in one way or another. There are different possibilities of such Rut Tantras. This idea, or this nexus of ideas, we can find both in Buddhist and in Shaiva material. But then we would have to cast our nets even wider, because similar ideas can be found also in other areas, not only in this of Yogini Tantras on the one hand and Shaiva Tantras on the other. Anyway, this material may look to you as if it has some problems. It does have some problems, but this is the reality of studying evidence, studying primary evidence. There are problems to deal with. I only hope that you can provisionally at least take it from me until you may have the chance to examine more broadly the evidence yourselves, that indeed we have here and in other passages some evidence for this idea. Yogini Tantras are teachings of Yoginis. Now, you might well wish to hear more about the contents of the Yogini Tantras, and perhaps something of a comparison of those contents with material on the Shakti side, and a discussion of their relationship. But these matters too are very vast, and I will have to only give you the very smallest of tastes of it. So here, under the heading A Characterization of Yogini Tantras, I quote from a well-known book by Ronald Davidson, a rather influential book, and certainly a very stimulating book, the 20th anniversary of which is approaching. Davidson writes, the subculture of Tantra composition, and he has Buddhist Tantras in mind, and then adds, especially the Yogini Tantras, exhibited clearly different values from those of the commentarial subculture. One is creative and outrageous, while the other represents rapprochement with institutional norms. And here, when he says one is creative and outrageous, the other represents rapprochement, this is, of course, yata sankhya, as they say in Sanskrit. The creative and outrageous one is the subculture of Tantric composition, especially the composition of the Yogini Tantras. So he is characterizing the scriptural literature as creative, outrageous, and he is telling us that, in his view, commentarial material is coming from a different subculture, rapprochement with institutional norms being its main feature, as here presented. Now, there is certainly something to what Davidson says here. It is a stimulating remark, as there is much in his book that is stimulating. But I want to just offer a counter view in some respects, by pointing out, although here I do not have citations for you right at hand, this was mainly a matter of my haste, that pointing out that there are in fact many examples which can be given of Yogini Tantra scriptures, the Tantras themselves, showing characteristics of commentaries and of what I think we can call a scholastic environment, or an environment in which the study of Buddhist doctrine, not only Buddhist tantric practice, but the study of Buddhist doctrine plays a very important role. So such examples are numerous. For instance, in a tantra like the Vajrayāna Tantra, another Yogini Tantra, or for that matter, the Samputa Tantra, or even in a tantra like the Hevajra Tantra, already mentioned and to be mentioned again. I think in all of these, in various degrees, we see at certain points characteristics of commentaries. For instance, in the Vajrayāna Tantra, there are really passages which are simply commentary in a commentarial, scholastic, if you wish, with no negative implication from my side, learned commentary on other parts or expressions in the same tantra. So my main point here was to suggest that Davidson's characterization is a bit too simple. Well, this is the problem. We are always making big generalizations. We have to some extent, but it's important that we gradually, at least, become aware of how big the generalizations are. And here, my main point again is to say that it is not so clear-cut. It is not the case that we can really simply say we have scriptures which come from one subculture, which is outrageous, etc. And we have commentarial literature, which is really coming from a different environment, has different concerns, etc. This is not so straightforward because, again, the scriptures themselves, as well as being, no doubt, creative and sometimes outrageous, they at the same time show characteristics of this learned environment and of commentarial style, even. So now I want to turn to look at one particular text within this group of Yogini Tantras. And it should be highlighted that the Yogini Tantra group is a very large group of material that survives. The material that survives is already very rich, and probably there was a great deal that does not survive. And certainly the texts themselves seem to suggest that this was a large body. Indeed, very, very large, very grand claims are made for the size of this particular branch of scripture. This matter is also, of course, somewhat tied up with the point that I briefly mentioned of the idea of root tantras at the moment not accessible, at least to ordinary people. So within this vast group of material, this vast body of material, I want to say a few things about the Hevajra Tantra. The Hevajra Tantra was, you remember, in the remark of Professor Sanderson, to which I'm providing an extended footnote, so to speak. It was one of the two texts that he mentioned as examples for this influence of Shaiva Shakta religion. The other text that he mentioned, just briefly, was the Laghu Shambhara. And about the Laghu Shambhara and its interdependence with Shaiva material, Professor Sanderson has himself written extensively. Perhaps the most thorough discussion that he has published so far is in his famous article of 2009, the monographic The Shaiva Age. But it certainly would not surprise me, or probably many people, if Professor Sanderson has, in the meantime, collected yet further material, which hopefully we will see at some point. So for the Laghu Shambhara, Professor Sanderson has done already a great deal, and what he has done establishes rather clearly, it seems to me, that there is a very high degree of interdependence with many parts of the Laghu Shambhara Tantra looking like they have been redacted rather hastily from Shaiva sources. And this has been a matter taken up for some discussion, and some others have disagreed with Professor Sanderson's explanation of the relationship between the material. So it's a complex matter, but from my point of view, it seems very clear that Professor Sanderson's explanation is correct. With this proviso, which I believe he has also added himself, at least in some places, that it cannot be simply stated that the Laghushambhara has directly borrowed from some of the Shaiva Tantras that we have accessible to us now. So it's not that one can make an extremely strong case of direct borrowing from one Shaiva Tantra still existent to the Laghushambhara Tantra. The process of interaction is no doubt more complex. Still, the basic point is, I think, very clear to one who examines his evidence, Professor Sanderson's evidence. So I take up instead the other Tantra, which Professor Sanderson mentioned, the Hevajra Tantra. And here we see that the situation is quite different from the situation of the Laghushambhara. So the Hevajra Tantra, now a study of its sources would be a very useful thing to do. It is something I'm much interested in. Here I have to again simplify a little bit and cast my net with a limited range. But first of all, I want to emphasize here that the Hevajra Tantra itself explicitly refers to the Tattva Sangraha, and this will be the Sarvatathagata Tattva Sangraha, a very famous Yoga Tantra, Buddhist Yoga Tantra. The Hevajra Tantra explicitly refers to this scripture as the default authority for mandala ritual in a sentence which I here quote, but it is perhaps not necessary to translate it immediately to you. So what we see here is, again, continuity on the Buddhist side. We are looking at a text which may have appeared perhaps in the 9th or late 9th century or the 10th century, perhaps even as late as that, not quite sure. Professor Sanderson, I think it at some point in his handout for the lecture which I quoted, may have suggested that the Buddhist Yogini Tantra material, which provides, first of all, for him some of the evidence for the influence of Śāktism, of Shakta material, that this is mainly from the 9th century onward. So let's for the moment indeed say that we are looking at texts from the 9th, 10th century. Some of them may well have appeared a little bit later than that. In any case, here, my point is to stress again that the Hevajra Tantra, one of these works, cannot be seen as dependent solely on Shaiva material. Again, such a claim was no doubt not intended by Professor Sanderson in his remark. But this is just to add something which is useful, I think, to add. There is some kind of interdependence with Shaiva material, also in the Hevajra, I would say, but the situation is, once more, quite different from with the Laghushambhara. The degree of interdependence and the degree of what scholars often call intertextuality is much smaller with the Hevajra Tantra, and the Hevajra Tantra, by contrast, shows also explicitly a high degree of dependence on and influence from Buddhist works, earlier Buddhist works, such as the Tattva Sangraha. Now, just as a rough ballpark figure, the Tattva Sangraha is a work which is likely to have existed in the 7th century, or late 7th century at the latest. So some centuries before the Buddhist Yogini Tantra material becomes prominent, and rather earlier than much of the Shaiva Shakta material. Small note, returning just for one moment to the Laghushambhara Tantra. Apart from all the very Shaiva-looking material that seems to have been redacted into it, there is also some degree of dependence, in fact, on earlier Buddhist Tantric material, including very likely the Tattva Sangraha. Directly or indirectly, there are passages, at least one comes to my mind at the moment, where we can see the influence of and probably borrowing from the Tattva Sangraha in the Laghu Shambhara. Okay, but again, one of my main points here is to highlight that within this Yogini Tantra class, we find a quite different situation, in fact, comparing the Hevajra Tantra and the Laghu Shambhara Tantra. I give here some examples of textual reuse on a very simple level. For instance, a verse from the Tattva Sangraha, the same Yoga Tantra, which we can find adapted in the Hevajra Tantra. This particular verse was very widespread. I think we can find it in quite a number of Buddhist tantras, by the way. So it is not quite that we can say the Hevajra Tantra must have taken this directly from the Tattva Sangraha. It may not be so simple. It is a verse, by the way, about the laying down of the mandala using a thread. And here, just briefly, to say that the general procedure is, of course, very similar to what we find on a Shaiva side. However, this particular verse does not have any close parallel that I know of on the Shaiva side. So we are looking most probably at an early 7th century, at the latest, I think, Buddhist formulation, which is continuing to be used for quite a number of centuries in Buddhist Tantric scriptural literature. And just briefly to add here that among other sources which seem to have been drawn on directly in the Hevajra Tantra are yet another early Yoga Tantra, the Vajrayāna Tantra, the Samajotara, not as early, I think, as the Tattva Sangraha and Vajrayāna, but a very important, influential work, which has it is usually not classified as Yogini Tantra, but it has had a very profound influence on Yogini Tantra. And finally, for the moment, possibly the Bodhicitta Vivarana, not a Tantra, but a Shastra, let us say. The word Vivarana ordinarily means explanation or commentary even. A small work attributed to A. Nagarjuna. Now I wrote here possibly because the relationship between Bodhicitta Vivarana and Hevajra Tantra might be still somewhat complex, but I regard it as likely, at least for the moment, that the Hevajra Tantra is the borrower here. Okay, so what is the point of these examples of textual reuse? The point is very simple, like most of my points. The point is to show that a Yogini Tantra such as the Hevajra has not only some degree of interdependence and influence from Shaiva material, it has also a very strong, indeed in the case of this particular Yogini Tantra, I think it is a much stronger degree of influence from and continuity from earlier Buddhist traditions. Yes, in fact, there are some striking further examples, which I realize I have not mentioned at all here, of material which one can trace back through earlier tantric material and back to, with changes in formulation, Mahayana Sutra material, which most scholars would say is probably pre-tantric and pre-4th century or so, maybe even quite a bit earlier than that. So again, all of this is to show that profound though the influence may be, how profound differs from case to case, profound though the influence may be of Shaktism material on Yogini Tantra material, at least in some cases, and I would say that it's in the majority of places, we can see a very strong degree also of continuity within Buddhist tradition. I pass to my next point, which was, I'm afraid that my points are becoming somewhat diverse here, so that my material starts to become as variegated, or nearly as variegated as some passages in Yogini Tantras are, though my material, I'm afraid, is on the whole far less appealing, except to the extent that it is borrowed from those tantras. The point that I wanted to jump to now was the consideration, again, a vast topic of the feminine, or let's say, are we dealing with yoginis, goddesses, who can be compared in a rather straightforward way with a Devi or a Mahadevi, a Durga or a Shakti on the Shaiva side. And I wanted mainly to highlight here that while we certainly can draw parallels and see influence, or we can put it that, for instance, roughly as Professor Sanderson, I think, was saying, on the Buddhist side, we see the wish to appeal to laity. I think that by this, he may have meant in that context that there was a strong popular strand of goddess worship, and that Buddhists found it necessary, perhaps, or at least useful, to appeal to this strand. Okay, so this is one way we can look at things, no doubt. But I wanted to highlight here that there are some differences also, which I think are intriguing to think about, even if, again, we only scratch the surface for the moment. So one thing to bear in mind here is a general kind of theoretical point or background. I'm going to make this very crudely, I'm afraid, for which apologies again. It is not normal on the Buddhist side to speak really, to use, for instance, the word Buddha in the feminine. Such a form is grammatically perfectly possible, but it is not very normal. Instead of the feeling that we perhaps have widespread among the laity or among popular, the general population in Eastern India and perhaps in other areas too, a feeling of devotion to female goddesses who are taken on face value, as it were, as female goddesses, as goddesses, deities who are female, and who may even be seen as an absolute or supreme deity in some cases, not necessarily. On the Buddhist side, we have a rather strong tendency to present such deities as forms which Buddhas, or sometimes Buddhas and advanced bodhisattvas, can take or can emanate when it is necessary to do so for the purpose of training or leading upwards certain sentient beings. For instance, this passage, which is somewhat famous from the Sarvatathagata Tattva Sangraha, Aho hi bodhicittasya sarvasattva hitaishita yadvinevashat viraha strirupam api kurvate. Well, without translating the whole thing, the essential part is telling us that for the sake of those to be trained, the heroes, masculine, and using a term which has, let's say, masculine connotations, they even create or make the form of a female. What is the idea that is conveyed is basically that of male Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who may appear as female. Now, these issues of gender are extremely complex, and I want to highlight that they have a kind of, they have an ancient history within Buddhism. And this has no doubt been discussed by many, many scholars, scholars who have not looked so much at tantric material, but at non-tantric material. For the moment, first I give you one more somewhat similar passage from the Dakini Vajrapandra, a tantra which is closely associated with the Hevajra Tantra. Here again we have the feature of a masculine yo, a masculine pronoun, the one who, Nairatma Yogini Abut, became the Yogini Nairatmya. And why did he do this? Stri Vinayam Jagat Trishva, having seen the world or having seen people to be trainable by a woman. So seeing that there are those who can be trained by a female form, a Buddha presented as male, masculine, becomes female. Namah Paramita Munaye, to that sage. Muni is also very commonly a synonym of Buddha. To that sage who is the perfection, obeisance, roughly something like this. So I want to highlight that from a Buddhist perspective, at least, first of all, that Buddhas are usually presented as being masculine, but there is already from a much earlier pre-tantric period, there's certainly a strong tradition also that such Buddhas may appear as female when it is expedient to do so, when it is helpful to sentient beings to do so. One could here, again, I'm tempted to digress, but time forbids it, I think. One could here go further to investigate, to speak about, in general, the nature of gender as conceived by Buddhist authors, a complex problem, but let me at least just briefly point out that one strand, at least, is that which you might call a more philosophical strand, which reminds us that gender is something unfixed, something fluid, something that is not essential, that like other things can change or is in flux, is in a state of flux. Therefore, any identification of ourselves as male or female should be seen. I have in here in mind, for instance, passages in a work such as the philosophical Madhyamaka work Chatushataka by Aryadeva, rather early Madhyamaka work, as passages which aim to remind us that our conception, I am a man or I am a woman, that such conceptions are rather limited and do not really touch the essentials of identities or anything like that. So such a tradition is rather strong, and here there is a connection which it would be interesting to pursue also to the matter of the high degree of popularity of sadhanas of female deities within Indian Tantric Buddhism. So a situation where we have male practitioners who, as their preferred form of practice, have one in which they identify themselves with a female deity. So these are somehow aspects or complexities which are rather important on the Buddhist side. But I move on from this because I have just a little time, I think, in which I should try to finish. My next slide was meant to highlight the idea, first of all, that on the Buddhist side, there's a strong tradition of seeing liberation or awakening, of seeing and presenting liberation or awakening as a syzygy of wisdom and means, where wisdom will be expressed very often with the word prajna, and means with the word upaya, prajna being grammatically female, feminine, and upaya being grammatically masculine. And for this, I gave you here a well-known passage from the Bhavanakrama of a famous Buddhist teacher, Kamalashila. This idea, of course, we can trace also in Mahayana Sutras, which are among Kamalashila's sources. It follows from this definition, I would suggest, that an explanation of the word yogini, such as that which we find in Abhayakara Gupta, the same learned commentator on the Buddhagopala Tantra, whom I cited before, an explanation of the word yogini, such as yogini iti prajnopaya samapatir yoga ityabhidiyate so tyantam asti asyaha. This explanation, which I could roughly translate as a yogini is one who utterly has atyantam asti asyaha yoga, which is to be understood as defined in the Samajottara. I gave the references Guhya Samaja Tantra 18.33. One could have said Samajottara 33. Prajñopaya samapattir yoga. Yoga is said to be the union of wisdom and means. So if we put these two things together, if it is allowable to put these two things together, and I would suggest that it is allowable. So on the one hand, the idea that it is the union, the perfect union or syzygy of prajna and upaya, wisdom and means, that is awakening or liberation. And then if we combine this with the Guhya Samaja telling us that yoga is prajnapaya samapatti, then to say that a yogini is one who utterly or to the highest degree possesses yoga so defined may imply that such a yogini is awakened or liberated. Okay. So yogini can be seen, if we combine these ideas, to be a word of feminine gender denoting someone who is liberated, who has this perfect union of the two. Okay, now this again will tie to complex issues of the relationship between wisdom and means, and these issues seem to me truly to be related to questions of the rise in popularity of Yogini Tantra. But this is just one aspect of very many which could further be explored. I have to apologize indeed for having given a chaotic presentation. I hope that I touched nonetheless on some things which will be of interest to others. And I have to conclude here. Thank you very much.